If I asked you to name the worst disease on the planet, what would you say? It's a subjective question with no correct answer, but if you were to construct a list of humanity's worst diseases, no matter which way you measure, rabies earns its way to the upper echelons of that list. Rabies is the deadliest disease on the planet, with a mortality rate of 99.9%. And that's if you round down. What this means is that if in a year there are 59,000 cases of rabies, we can also say that there are 59,000 rabies deaths. The symptoms it inflicts upon its victims are so terrible, so alien, that it's the inspiration behind many of humanity's most terrifying fictional creatures. Zombies, werewolves, and of course, vampires. It is of great public health significance because, as deadly as it is, its prevalence can be greatly reduced by targeted interventions, as has been done in Europe and North America. In the 21st century, most rabies deaths come from impoverished countries. Today, we will be talking about this horrible and fatal disease. The World Health Organization calls rabies a vaccine-preventable zoonotic viral disease. Let's break that down. First, rabies is vaccine-preventable, but we'll get to that later. Rabies is zoonotic, meaning that it spreads to humans by animals. Rabies can infect and be delivered to humans by any mammal, though the most common are dogs, raccoons, and bats. Rabies is a viral disease. The pathogen that causes rabies is the rabies virus, within the genus Lysovirus. It is a bullet shape, and it transmits its instructions for replication with negative-stranded RNA. Rabies is a disease as old as human civilization. The first written records of rabies appear in the Eshnunna Code, a legal code in the 23rd century BC for the town Eshnunna in Mesopotamia, now modern-day Iraq. The code reads, "If a dog is mad and the authorities have brought the fact to the knowledge of its owner, if he does not keep it in and it bites a man and causes his death, then the owner shall pay 2/3 of a mine in silver." This writing shows that even then there was a known connection between the bite of a mad dog and death. Another reference comes from the 9th century BC, when in the Iliad Homer compared Hector to a rabid dog. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote his Natural History of Animals. In it, while describing rabies, he says, "Dogs suffer from the madness. This causes them to become very irritable, and all animals they bite become diseased." It should be noted that while Aristotle was aware of rabies, he believed it didn't affect humans. Then in the 2nd century AD, the Roman surgeon Galen wrote, "So great does the corruption of their humors become that their spittle alone, if it falls upon man, can make him become rabid." By now, we are recognizing that rabies is transmitted to humans via the saliva of a rabid dog. There were many other, we'll say, less accurate conjectures for the origin of rabies. In the Talmud, it is suggested that rabies could be caused by witches' spells or evil spirits. Ibn Sina, one of the most important scientists of the Islamic Golden Age, believed that rabies was caused by a change in temperature. The belief that temperature was a causative factor was shockingly common. Many Romans believed it was caused by the star Sirius, which shows during the hottest months of the year. Sun Si Miao, a Chinese physician, wrote during the 7th century AD, quote, "Starting from the end of spring to the beginning of summer, nearly all dogs become rabid. Warning must be given to the children and to the weak people to take sticks in hand to defend against attack by rabid dogs." First of all, you see here another example that seems to be during the hot months when people are most effective. Second, you can see the beginnings of public health advice on how to avoid rabies. As rabies was an incurable and fatal disease, many desperate, experimental, and dubious treatments emerged. A common myth was that rabies was caused by a worm at the base of the tongue. As such, it was believed that rabies could be cured by extracting the worm from a rabid dog, carrying it around a fire 3 times, and injecting it into a person. Related treatments emerged, such as eating maggots from a carcass of a dead dog. In the 2nd century AD, the Greek philosopher Celsus suggested throwing people displaying symptoms of rabies into water and letting them sink if they could not swim. This was meant to address hydrophobia, or the fear of water, which was, and is, a common and unique symptom of rabies. The practice of throwing victims into water stuck around until the 19th century. In 1735, there are records of 2 men who advertised themselves as water dippers. They would charge high fees to submerge dog bite victims in the River Severn. Herbal remedies were also common. In Nicholas Culpeper's 1649 book, Complete Herbal, which he published in England, he lists filbert nuts, hellebore, rose oil, and chamomile tea as treatments for rabies. There existed also more compelling, efficacious treatments, even at the time. As early as the 1st century AD, Cicero suggested suction of a wound, and in other cases, cauterization. In the 2nd century, Galen too suggested cauterization. The same treatment was practiced as far away as the Americas, where the indigenous population found that burning the wounds of bat bites with hot coals eliminated the danger of death. It seems that people understood cleaning the site of a wound was important in treating later disease. By the 19th century, many promising innovations were emerging. Animal experimentation confirmed that saliva from a rabid animal was a route of infection. French biologist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur is credited with landmark discoveries regarding the virus. First, he found that the virus was housed in the brain and spinal cord, and second, that only injection of the virus into the brain of an animal guaranteed its paralysis and death. This proved that the brain was the crucial organ in the progression of rabies. On March 16, 1884, the New York Times declared, M. Pasteur yesterday made an interesting communication to the Paris Academy of Sciences in relation to canine madness. His experiments had shown him that an injection in the region of the skull of the virus of rabies always produced the malady in an acute form, but that an injection in the veins only occasionally had acute results, being often followed by chronic affection only, without barking or ferocity. If a dog were inoculated with fragments of marrow or of nerve taken from a mad dog, the disease would be communicated. M. Pasteur further stated that he had rendered 20 dogs proof against the disease by inoculating them with other virus than the virus of rabies. That last bit is super important. Pasteur had successfully inoculated 20 dogs against rabies. In fact, Pasteur went on to conduct the first successful human inoculation against rabies. On July 5th, 1885, Joseph Meister was attacked by a rabid dog. Pasteur used spinal fragments from rabid rabbits to inoculate Meister against the disease. A New York Times column from 3 months after the attack tells the story. A boy, 12 years of age, named Meister, who had been bitten 14 times, came from Alsace with his mother to see Dr. Pasteur. The autopsy of the dog which had bitten the boy left no doubt as to it having suffered from hydrophobia. It should be noted that by suffering from hydrophobia, they mean rabies. Dr. Pasteur took the celebrated Dr. Vulpian and a professor of the School of Medicine to see the boy Meister. These 2 doctors came to the conclusion that the boy was doomed to a painful death and might be experimented upon. In 13 days, inoculations were made upon Meister with pieces of spinal marrow containing virus of constantly increasing strength, the last being from the spine of a rabbit that died only the day before. Now 100 days have passed since Meister underwent the last inoculation. The treatment has been thoroughly successful and the boy is in perfect health. He had been bitten 60 hours and traveled from Alsace to Paris before the first inoculation was performed. A shepherd boy named Judith, aged 15, was bitten by a mad dog a fortnight ago and has now been a week under treatment. Dr. Pasteur is confident of curing him. Pasteur, for the first time, had treated the untreatable. As revolutionary as Pasteur's inoculation was, many improvements still had to be made. First was to treat the rabbit's spinal cords with carbolic acid rather than drying them, to create a more reproducible process. Still, it was humanity's first true victory against this dastardly disease. I hope you found that history interesting. I think it's time now that you understand what rabies is and why it was and still is so feared. As we already discussed, rabies is a vaccine-preventable zoonotic disease. The most common way someone contracts rabies is through the bite of a rabid animal. In rare cases, rabies is also spread by scratches, other open wounds, or mucous membranes exposed to infected saliva. And in extremely rare cases, it's spread through organ transplants or through the air in certain laboratory conditions. Contact with blood or urine of an infected animal has not been demonstrated to spread rabies. Once rabies enters your body, it begins slowly crawling up your nerves, trying to reach the central nervous system. During this time, you might feel a prickling sensation at the initial entry site, as well as infection or inflammation in that area. Before the virus reaches the central nervous system, you can be vaccinated against rabies. The rabies virus usually takes between 20 and 90 days to reach the central nervous system. Once there, it begins rapidly replicating and quickly spreads throughout the brain and along sensory and autonomic nerves to multiple organs, especially the brain, spinal cord, and salivary glands. It is once the virus reaches the central nervous system that you begin to feel symptoms. At this point, there is no known treatment that will save you. Initially, the symptoms may be flu-like and can include fever, headache, nausea, and vomiting. As the disease progresses, victims may begin feeling anxiety, agitation, and confusion. Swallowing becomes difficult, and the salivary glands go into overdrive, producing excess saliva. This is where the telltale foaming of the mouth comes from. At the ultimate stage of the illness, swallowing becomes so difficult that victims experience painful spasms of the throat if they try. They develop hydrophobia, which is the fear of water. They develop hallucinations, insomnia, and partial paralysis. They sometimes slip into a coma. Victims of rabies eventually die from cardiopulmonary complications, multiple organ failure, or from drowning in their own saliva. I think now you can get a sense of just how terrible and hopeless rabies is. This is why it has been so feared, and why we've been willing to try such questionable treatments. When your probability of a horrible death is 100%, you are willing to try literally anything to avoid it. The Mayo Clinic says, once a person begins showing signs and symptoms of rabies, the disease nearly always causes death. For this reason, anyone who may have a risk of contracting rabies should receive rabies vaccinations for protection. Nearly always causes death. As much as we desperately search to cure rabies, the only way to prevent death is to stop it altogether before it takes foothold in your brain. Before I move on, I should tell you that the symptoms I described earlier are for furious rabies, only one of its two forms, the more common and well-known form. In about 20% of human cases, though, the victim develops paralytic rabies. This form is less dramatic. It usually lasts longer. The victim's muscles slowly become paralyzed, starting at the bite site, before they slip into a coma and eventually die. This form of rabies is harder to diagnose due to a lack of distinct symptoms that usually accompany furious rabies. As a result, it's often underreported. Rabies is obviously terrible on the human level, but how does it measure on the macro scale? Annually, 59,000 people die due to rabies. The vast majority of these deaths are caused by dog bites. 90% of exposures and 99% of rabies deaths worldwide are attributable to dogs. 95% of all rabies cases occur in Asia and Africa, and 80% of rabies cases are in rural areas. The World Health Organization comments, managing a rabies exposure, where the average cost of rabies post-exposure prophylaxis is currently estimated at an average of $108, can be a catastrophic financial burden on affected families, whose average daily income may be as low as $1 to $2 per person. Rabies prevention is cost prohibitive. We have the tools to virtually eliminate all the disease. The issue is proper resource allocation. I want you to think about that. Rabies post-exposure prophylaxis is $108. That's a no-brainer to you if you are living in a wealthy country and you think you may have been affected. But someone living on $1 to $2 a day? How do you justify that? Especially when maybe you were only scratched by an animal. Who would think you're going to develop rabies from that? And $108, that's potentially a third of the year worth of working for you. For a prevention you might not even need. That is why rabies is so prevalent in impoverished countries. The CDC adds, because vaccines to prevent human rabies have been available for more than 100 years, most deaths from rabies occur in countries with inadequate public health resources and limited access to preventative treatment. These countries also have few diagnostic facilities and almost no rabies surveillance. In the United States, rabies is far less prevalent due to an intensive dog vaccination program. Only 1 to 3 cases of rabies are reported annually in the United States, and many of those are acquired outside of the country. The US spends $300 million annually vaccinating dogs, so most US cases of rabies come from bats. While exposure risk varies greatly from region to region, the mortality rate of rabies is the same no matter where you go. It is a virtually guaranteed death curse once you develop symptoms, regardless of your wealth or your access to medicine. As I mentioned earlier, rabies has the highest mortality rate of any disease on Earth at 99.9%. Since 1970, there have only been 7 well-documented cases of someone surviving rabies. Assuming a constant 59,000 rabies deaths each year since then, that puts your chance at surviving rabies at 1 in 430,000. If that number is too big for you to make sense of, and don't worry if it is, it's too big for me to make sense of, I have a game for you. Do you know how sometimes at museums they give you character cards of a real person that you take around and you see what your person did and you learn of the ultimate fate of this character? We're going to do that here. I'm now giving you all rabies, but you get to play a game of chance to see if you survive. A warning. It's not an easy game. First, flip a coin. Flip a coin again. Now roll 2 dice. Now, I want you to randomly pick a card from a well-shuffled deck of 52 cards. Put your card back, shuffle the deck again, and pull 1 more card. Now, unless you flip to tails, then a heads, then roll the 3, then roll the 4, then pull the jack of clubs, and then finally pull the 4 of diamonds. Unless you did all of those exact things, you died. If you managed to do all of that, there's still a 10% chance that you die anyway. That is how absurdly small the chance of surviving rabies is. This absurdly small chance of survival is why many will just round up and say rabies has a 100% rate of death. I don't want you to come away from this feeling hopeless against rabies, though. Remember, we've already learned that it's virtually eradicated in the US and other wealthy countries. Preventative measures are the most important step in the fight against rabies. The Mayo Clinic, CDC, and World Health Organization all agree. Vaccinate your pets. The World Health Organization adds, vaccinating dogs is the most cost-effective strategy for preventing rabies in people. Other preventative measures you can follow include keep your pets supervised and protect them from predators. Report stray animals to the authorities. Don't approach wild animals. Keep bats out of your home, and consider getting the rabies vaccine if you're traveling, especially to an area where the risk of exposure is high. A preemptive vaccine is also recommended to scientists working with the rabies virus and other lysoviruses. Recommended also to wildlife rangers, outdoor travelers, and people living in remote areas with high exposure risk. Educating communities on dog behavior, bite prevention, responsible pet ownership, and immediate care after bites is another essential step in the public health response to rabies. Because rabies is a zoonotic disease, it is considered a quintessential example of a disease requiring a One Health approach. The World Health Organization comments, "Engagement of multiple sectors in One Health collaboration, including community education, awareness programs, and vaccination campaigns, are critical." Furthermore, rabies is considered a success story where the One Health approach has been implemented. The World Health Organization claims, "A cross-sectoral approach that provides treatment after dog bites and vaccinates the local dog population has been successful at reducing human rabies deaths in Sri Lanka and also in many countries in Latin America." I'm sure you're thinking now, "Ryan, this is all great, but I've already been bitten by a rabid animal. What do I do now?" Great question. Thank you for asking. The process of treating an animal bite victim is called post-exposure prophylaxis. If you were listening carefully, I believe that word came up earlier. Post-exposure prophylaxis is abbreviated PEP. Because the rabies virus is undetectable until disease onset, which, as we've already learned, is too late, bite victims must be treated as though they have for sure been exposed to rabies. The goal of PEP, therefore, is to prevent virus entry into the central nervous system. The World Health Organization classifies 3 risk categories. Category 1 is the least severe, and it's given for touching or feeding animals, as well as licks to intact skin. At this level, you're not considered to have been exposed at all. You need only to wash the exposed surfaces of your skin. At Category 2 is nibbling of uncovered skin or minor scratches without bleeding from an animal. At this level, you're recommended to wash the wound for at least 15 minutes with soap and water and immediately get the rabies vaccine. If you've heard that the rabies vaccine is 21 shots in the stomach, that was once the case. Nowadays, it's a 5-shot treatment course over 14 days. Risk Category 3 is the most severe and includes bites or scratches that break the skin, as well as contamination of mucous membranes with animal saliva. At this level, victims are recommended all the previous treatments and to additionally be administered with rabies immunoglobulin. The immunoglobulin is a dose of antibodies that prevents the virus from gaining any foothold in the body. If you're bitten by a rabid animal, as long as you receive quick and proper post-exposure prophylaxis, it's a fun tongue twister, by the way. Proper post-exposure prophylaxis. Proper post-exposure prophylaxis. But as long as you receive quick and proper post-exposure prophylaxis, you will be okay. The danger is when you don't. So if you don't get post-exposure prophylaxis and you begin showing symptoms of rabies, are you just doomed? Based on everything I've told you so far, the answer would seem to be yes. I want to tell you a story. On September 12, 2004, Gina Giese attended Mass with her mother at St. Pat's Church in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. By the way, my mom was raised in Fond du Lac, so I have a special connection to this story. About 15 minutes before the end of service, a bat began flying around the congregation. As a self-described animal lover, Gina took it upon herself to pick up the bat and release it outside. Bats, as you probably know, are nocturnal, so the fact it was flying around during the day should have been the first sign that something was wrong. As Gina walked outside, the bat sank its fangs into her finger. It took 30 seconds before she could rip it off. Gina said about the bite, "That hurt! Like a needle injecting acid into your fingertip." Gina washed the wound and thought nothing of it. Exactly 1 month and 1 day later, Gina began experiencing flu-like symptoms. The next day, she awoke barely able to move and passed out multiple times, having double vision. 2 days more, and she was in such bad shape that she was taken to the emergency room. She tested negative for flu and was sent home. The next day, Gina was hospitalized. She was tested for everything the doctors could think of, all negative. Her arm was jerking, she had excess saliva, and she couldn't talk. The following morning, while Gina's doctor checked on her, Gina's mom suddenly remembered about the bat bite and shared it with the doctor. The doctor's face went pale, and he rushed out of the room. Gina was transported to the Children's Hospital of Milwaukee. On the 18th of October 2004, 36 days after she was bitten, Gina Giese tested positive for rabies. She was given 4 hours to live. Her doctor, Dr. Willoughby, was not ready to give up. He had read that autopsies from previous rabies victims showed no brain damage. Curious. This suggested that rabies only interferes with neurochemical communication. Essentially, rabies kills the victim by overstimulating the brain and causing death in that way. Willoughby hypothesized that if he induced a coma in Gina, he could prevent harm to her neurons due to overexcitement and give her immune system time to mount an effective response. Gina Giese was put under a medically induced coma for 7 days. 31 days later, she was removed from isolation. On January 1st, 2005, she went home. A New York Times article from that November exclaimed, "A Wisconsin teenager is the first ever to survive rabies without vaccination," the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said yesterday after she received a desperate and novel type of therapy. Dr. Charles Ruprecht of the Disease Control Agency called the recovery historic. Gina Giese had survived rabies, and Dr. Willoughby had implemented an innovation more significant in the human fight against rabies than anyone since Pasteur, all the way back in 1885. Or had he? Since 2005, the Milwaukee Protocol has been criticized many times. In fact, it is now no longer recommended, and it is blacklisted by the medical community. Regarding the Milwaukee Protocol, an article published in the Journal of Antiviral Research reads, "There is no clear scientific rationale or other evidence supporting its use for rabies or other CNS infections." The article further laments, "Continued repetitions of the Milwaukee Protocol has made it more difficult to move forward with the development of new therapies." Since Gina, there is not a single well-documented case of the Milwaukee Protocol succeeding, while there are 26 well-documented cases of failure. Some people claim that there were 4 more successful implementations of the Milwaukee Protocol. Unfortunately, these are false reports. 2 cases, one in Colombia and one in Peru, were actually fatal. One patient who was included as a Milwaukee Protocol survivor had actually been vaccinated prior to developing symptoms. And one patient, from California, recovered quickly, never developed rabies antibodies, and probably never had rabies in the first place. Even knowing this information, you might still insist about the Milwaukee Protocol. It worked once, and there's no better solution. Why not keep trying? I thought this too, but this argument is just as flawed for the Milwaukee Protocol as it was when it was used to support throwing rabies victims into the water. Remember what I said earlier? When your chance of a horrible death is 100%, sometimes you're willing to do anything, even when it doesn't make sense. So why doesn't the Milwaukee Protocol make sense? Well, for every one implementation of the Milwaukee Protocol, 16,000 rounds of post-exposure prophylaxis can be administered at the same cost. And more importantly, when doctors fall back on the Milwaukee Protocol, it prevents them from experimenting with other solutions that might ultimately turn out to be the successful cure. So how did Gina survive? Well, tests showed that she had already begun mounting an immune response prior to her induced coma. This suggests that she might have just been lucky enough to have an extraordinary immune system capable of clearing the virus on its own. And Gina was bitten by a bat. Why is that important? Well, the more research is done, the more we discover that dogs are the ones that carry the most severe form of rabies, the most virulent. Sometimes bats just carry weaker strains of rabies, increasing the immune system's ability to fight it. I also want to be fair to Dr. Willoughby. Shortly after treating Gina, he said, "You have to see this therapy repeated successfully in another patient. Until then, it is a miracle." Even Willoughby acknowledges that his solution was miraculous and may not be repeatable. The conclusion to the antiviral research article I referenced earlier reads, "Although the positive outcome in this case is attributed to the treatment regimen, it more likely reflects the patient's own brisk immune response, as anti-rabies antibodies were detected at the time of hospital admission, even though she had not been vaccinated. This conclusion is supported by the failure of the Milwaukee Protocol to prevent death in numerous subsequent cases. Use of this protocol should therefore be discontinued. Further research should focus on the use of animal models to improve understanding of the pathogenesis of rabies and for the development of new therapeutic approaches. Unfortunately, the Milwaukee Protocol turned out to be one more failed cure that joins the ranks of water dipping, maggot eating, and herbal remedies. I want to finish by discussing the present and future challenges associated with rabies. On September 28, 2018, the World Health Organization introduced its United Against Rabies collaboration with the goal of eliminating dog-mediated rabies. Dog-mediated rabies being rabies from dog bites. They wanted to eliminate this by 2030. They emphasized the need for an intersectoral One Health approach involving the World Health Organization, World Organization for Animal Health, Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and the Global Alliance for Rabies Control. Beyond eliminating rabies, the plan's aim is to, quote, offer an integrated response to country needs through empowering, engaging, and enabling them to lead and strengthen elimination efforts. Highlights of the plan include assisting governments in designing One Health strategic plans for control and elimination, preparing guidelines for effective rabies management, supporting veterinary services and health systems to comply with the World Organization for Animal Health standards, to deliver high-quality dog rabies vaccines using the collaboration's vaccine banks, to develop local laboratory testing, and providing financial resources to particular countries to bolster their rabies control efforts. While the World Health Organization races ahead in the prevention front, promising research is emerging regarding the survivability of rabies. In a study of 2 Peruvian villages in the Amazon, 10% of people tested appeared to have survived rabies infection without a vaccination. Our dear Dr. Willoughby called the study a game changer. He said, "If these findings are confirmed and extended, then it would show that rabies can vary in severity, rather than being 100% fatal." The objective now is to continue these studies to see if it can lead to better understanding of rabies prevention and survivability. At the end of all this, I hope you understand just how terrifying rabies can be. At the same time, I want you to recognize that with targeted public health interventions, rabies can be almost completely eliminated, as it has been in much of the developed world. While we all wait with bated breath for the next study to be the pivotal breakthrough that shows rabies can be cured after all, we must waste no time in deploying all of our available resources to take preventative measures that prevent people from developing rabies in the first place. 59,000 people die each year from rabies. With enough global education, cooperation, and coordination, that number could be 0. Hello all, I'm Ryan. I am the podcast host, obviously. I just want to take a moment to make a few acknowledgements. First of all, this would not have at all been possible without the numerous helpful and informative and detailed sources. I tried to reference the ones that I could where they made sense, but there are still so many more to cite. So a full annotated bibliography for this podcast can be found at the following link: tinyurl.com/kpmta2jf. That is tinyurl.com/kpmta2jf. Any music and sound effects used in this podcast were downloaded from YouTube's library of copyright-free music and sound effects, which are intended for creators to use in their projects. Finally, I want to thank you for listening. I hope you found this podcast even a fraction as interesting and enjoyable as I found the research process. I wish you good health and happiness.